approaching the last week of October here, and I realized that I have read quite a lot of books this month. I think at the moment it stands at 19 books, and I figured I would do a two-part reading wrap-up for this month to spare you all a extra long video and to spare myself the necessity of having to edit an extra long video. So the plan is to have this video be a wrap-up of all of the graphic novels that I read this month. I read 11, and then have part 2 of this wrap-up cover the novels as well as the poetry collections that I read. As far as order goes, I wanted to try a bit of a ranking system and start with the graphic novels that I enjoyed the least and work up to the ones that I enjoyed the most. So starting off with the graphic novel that I got along the least well with, and that is Cyberpunk 2077 Trauma Team. This one I just didn't have a good time with. Thankfully it was only 96 pages long, so it was a very short read. The good things that I have to say about this graphic novel is the art was very vibrant and well done, character design was great. It was mainly the writing and storytelling that really fell flat for me with this one. I'm not sure if this was supposed to be a companion graphic novel along with the Cyberpunk 2077 video game that came out recently. It just felt like a bit of context was missing from this work, as well as any sort of world building or understanding of what was going on. And I have to wonder, if you have played the video game, if you would have gotten along better with this, having known that world and the setup. But the main character for this one is named Nadia, who is an EMT for a private medical group called Trauma Team International. Again, maybe there's more context for who this group is within the video game, but just based on the graphic novel, they are confusingly seemingly a private medical group of SWAT team slash EMTs that go into gang shootouts to recover certain clients from these scenarios. These clients will call in the trauma teams to rescue them from either an assassination attempt or a shootout situation. I guess they pay like a premium to this company to save their life. The story starts out with Nadia going on a mission with her team and having all of her team members killed in front of her. She is the sole survivor of this one mission, and she goes through sort of corporate therapy to see if she's ready to be back in the field. They put her back in the field, and she struggles with what appear to be PTSD flashbacks to her previous team, and also come to find out the client that they have been sent in to rescue is the person that blatantly killed all of her previous team members in cold blood. I would say that about 75% to 80% of this book was literally just coverage of shootout scenarios, which really didn't do it for me, with like little bits of flashback here and there to like past things and the corporate therapy that Nadia was in. But what I really wanted was more context as for how this world worked, who these characters were, why I should care. The dialogue just felt very predictable and stiff to me, if I'm completely honest. I gave this one 1 star out of 5, and I don't think I will be continuing with this series. Next on this ranked tier is the first volume of Sandman: Preludes and Nocturnes by Neil Gaiman, which I enjoyed quite a bit more than the previous graphic novel. I initially picked this up, having heard about it for years and heard good things about it, but also started watching the Netflix adaptation of this series and was really enjoying it and wanted to engage with the source material. The first volume starts out with an occultist in, I believe, the 1930s, 40s, attempting to capture Death, but instead he captures Death's younger brother, Dream. Dream, also known as Morpheus, is essentially imprisoned by this occultist for about 70 years until he finally breaks free. In the time that he was imprisoned, his objects of power, his source of power and magic, have been stolen from him, and he needs to go on a quest to reclaim these objects to be able to reclaim and rebuild his kingdom, the dream world, which has fallen into ruin and disrepair in his absence. I will say I did enjoy this first volume, but it was not quite what I was expecting. The edition of this volume that I read had an introduction by the original publisher, as well as an afterword by Neil Gaiman himself, talking about, I believe it was a 10-year anniversary edition, but looking back and talking about sort of the initial publishing process and creation of Sandman as a character and as a graphic novel series. And both of them were sort of mentioning and touching on how the first couple volumes are a little bit rough looking back at them. Neil Gaiman himself talking about how the first couple volumes were really where he was finding his feet and figuring out his character, and he's much more proud of the later volumes, which was interesting to think about looking back at some of the episodes of the Netflix adaptation of this series and comparing them with my experience to reading this graphic novel. Personally, I think I enjoyed the TV adaptation a little bit more than I did the graphic novel. Part of me wonders if that is because the format of the TV adaptation just allows for more exploration and fleshing things out. Neil Gaiman was also on set when they were filming this, and I have to wonder if he took this as an opportunity to tweak and revise his original story a little bit. That being said, I have only watched the first 3 episodes of the TV adaptation. I'm looking forward to watching the rest of them with my partner. He really enjoys this graphic novel series. I will say the other thing that kind of threw me off with this graphic novel was the art style and the coloring. The energy that I was getting from the TV adaptation was a lot, I would say, broodier, darker, kind of moody. Whereas the graphic novel, you had a lot of the colors being very bright and bold and almost, I would say, cartoony in a way. Whereas the story that it's telling is not necessarily aligned with that, it felt like. I did have an interesting conversation with my partner about this, and I was mentioning this to him, and he gave me a little context as to why that might be. He was telling me about the history of graphic novels and comics and how when Sandman was coming out, this first volume, you had comics that were starting to incorporate a bit more violence, a bit more of some of the darker themes that we now find are very common. But the art style, the coloring hadn't necessarily caught up to that. Having that bit of context helps me understand why that choice was made. But overall, I did still quite enjoy this first volume of Sandman. I would like to continue on with the series at some point. But overall, I gave this first volume of Sandman 3.5 out of 5 stars. I also read and enjoyed the first 2 volumes of the Lock and Key series. I picked these up thinking that they would give me some sort of gothic and spooky vibes, which they definitely did. The story involves a family that is moving across country in the wake of their father's murder. He was a guidance counselor at a school, and he had a student come and essentially try to murder him and his entire family. Thankfully, the rest of his family was able to escape, but unfortunately he was not as lucky. So his family have moved across country from California to New England, to the house that their father grew up in, that they've spent summers at. As they're moving in, they start to discover that there's a little bit more to this house than they may have previously realized. The youngest child starts to discover that there are certain magical keys that open doors in this house that allow you to become a ghost, that transport you to certain locations. A lot of the characters in this series are dealing with a lot of trauma, obviously, a lot of guilt, survivor's guilt. The kids are all trying to adjust to this life that has been turned upside down. The mom is obviously grieving the loss of her husband, and trying to figure out how she's going to take care of these 3 kids. For the first volume especially, there's definitely a content warning that I would put up for violence, gore, suicidal ideation. It is pretty dark. That being said, I did enjoy this story. I gave both volumes, I think, a 3.5 out of 5 stars. I think there's also a Netflix adaptation of this series as well. I think it has a little bit of a different twist though, if I am remembering correctly. But I definitely plan on continuing with the series, seeing where it goes, and then possibly watching the Netflix series as well. Next on the list that I read and enjoyed was Clementine Book 1 by Tillie Walden. Tillie Walden is a graphic novelist that I've been meaning to check out for quite some time, and I picked this one up just out of sheer curiosity and also because it was available at my library. This is a graphic novel set in the world of The Walking Dead, which I have never read or watched the TV show, but sort of know the general premise of the world has collapsed due to a zombie apocalypse. There are still some surviving groups and people trying to make their way, and this story focuses on Clementine, who is a 17-year-old girl who is wandering north, attempting to get to Vermont and possibly Canada. I'm not sure if she's a character that already exists within this world, if she's someone that showed up in the TV series. I have no idea. Thankfully, it didn't feel like I was missing out on too much context or backstory. I felt like I could jump into this story and follow it. Clementine is an amputee who is wandering around with a self-created prosthetic, and in the first couple chapters she wanders into what I believe to be an Amish settlement. They have a doctor there who fits her out with a much more sturdy and stable prosthetic, And as she's leaving the settlement, she teams up with a boy who is leaving the settlement as well and also heading north for a potential job that he's looking for. Clementine and this boy, Amos, become friends on their journey north, but when they reach this supposed job site, it turns out that it's not quite what Amos thought it was going to be, and so Clementine decides to stick with him to make sure that he doesn't get screwed over. Throughout this book, there's definitely an internal and sometimes external dialogue that Clementine has with herself and others about finding the difference between just surviving in this world that has essentially gone to shit and finding a way to live and finding things to live for. Clementine has definitely lived a life of trauma with a lot of loss of people in her life, either being killed or leaving her, and she struggles with wanting to make attachments with new people just based on the amount of people that she has lost. She doesn't want to continually keep going through that cycle of finding someone, caring about them, and then losing them in some way or another. In the end, part of the story is about her starting to break through that and starting to make some connections again and forging relationships with people rather than doing what she initially thought that she was going to be doing, which was running away to the north so that she could live on her own and not have to deal with the pain of losing people in her life. Overall, I still enjoyed this graphic novel. I will definitely be picking up the second volume if and when it comes to my local library. I'd say I enjoyed this about the same as the Lock and Key series, so 3.5 stars out of 5. This month I also read Paris by Andy Watson, which is a very cute graphic novel depicting a queer romance set in 1950s Paris between an American art student who is studying in Paris, who is commissioned to paint the portrait of a young British debutante. They meet at this painting session and sparks start to fly. I quite enjoyed the art style in this graphic novel. There were some really lovely full-page spreads of Paris street life where you kind of had to hunt and find the main characters of a graphic novel. Overall, this was just very cute, very much enjoyed it, would definitely recommend it. I think I gave it 4.25 out of 5 stars. I read the first 2 volumes in the Lumberjane series, which is a series that I've been meaning to read for quite a long time. This is by N.D. Stevenson. This is very much a fun, lighthearted romp with some cute queer representation taking place at a summer camp. However, at this camp there are definitely some strange and mythological happenings in the woods around the cabins. The art style in these is very fun and bright. There's lots of adventure, some very, at least in the first 2, some very lovely, subtle queer representation that I hope gets built on. Even though this is set in a summer camp, for some reason this just felt very cozy and autumnal to me when I read it, so I really enjoyed it for reading in the fall. And overall, I really enjoyed the first 2 volumes of this series. I will definitely be continuing on. It's definitely a series that I'll dip into when I'm looking for something cozy and fun and lighthearted. Next, I wanted to talk about the graphic novel Ghost Tree by Bobby Curnow, which definitely plays with elements of Japanese mythological folklore. We follow our main character Brant, who is returning to Japan, having made a promise to his grandfather that he would return to his grandfather's house 10 years after his grandfather passed away. Brant is fleeing his crumbling marriage in hopes of reconnecting with one of the last places that he feels he's ever been happy. I really enjoyed the art of this graphic novel. I thought it was gorgeously done. The story itself explores what happens when Brant, as well as his grandfather, spend too much time, literally and figuratively, speaking with ghosts. What happens when you spend too much time with the ghosts of your family, the ghosts of your past, your own ghost, and you forget to live in the present with the people around you. There are definitely themes in this graphic novel of loss, of having to let go and face reality and the future. Overall, I really, really enjoyed this graphic novel. I gave it 4.75 out of 5 stars, and I don't think that there are any sequential graphic novels in the same storyline, but I will definitely be checking out other works by this author. And finally, the last 2 graphic novels that I read and were my favorites this month were volumes 2 and 3 of the Pretty Deadly series. The series is by Kelly Sue DeConnick. I read the first volume, I believe it was at the very end of September. Loved it so much that I really wanted to continue on with the series right away. Thankfully, my library had the next 2 volumes available. For context, the first volume of this series is set, I believe, in the 1880s, 1890s in the American West, The series itself as a whole plays a lot with ideas of mythology and folklore. The main character of the series is named Ginny, and she is the daughter of Death, and she is a Reaper of Vengeance. Throughout the series you will meet other Reapers that have different jurisdictions: the Reaper of Greed, the Reaper of Fortune, the Reaper of Obsession. There is definitely a very strong content warning for violence in this series, especially in the first volume. However, that being said, this is probably one of my favorite graphic novel series of all time at this point. It is beautifully illustrated, the art is gorgeous, as well as the storytelling is just, I'll just have to use the word delicious. It's delicious. The second volume that I read this month is a continuation from the first volume. It's set, I think, 30-40 years later than the first volume in 1920s America, as well as the trenches of World War I. You follow some of the same characters who are Reapers. You also meet some new human characters that are descendants from the human characters in the first volume. The third volume in this series takes place in 1930s Hollywood. There is definitely a bit of a murder mystery element to it. There is a continuation of the theme of encountering different Reapers, different archetypes, and how that reflects on the characters in that story. I don't want to give too much away with this series just because I think it's very unique and it is more fun to go in a little bit blind. I think the third volume of this graphic novel series came out in 2020, and I'm really hoping that the author and the artist continue to make volumes because I will read every single one of them. But again, the artwork and the storytelling in this series is just absolutely stunning. I would highly recommend it if you are looking for a new graphic novel series to pick up. Both of these were definitely a 5-star read for me this month. And that is all, my friends. Those were the 11 graphic novels that I read in the month of October. The second part of this wrap-up will be coming up in the next week or so, telling you about some of the novels and poetry collections that I read, but I figured I would do myself and you a favor by splitting the wrap-up in half. But if you've made it this far through the video, thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed it. If you would like to see more from me, you can subscribe, and also if you liked this video, you can give it a thumbs up. That apparently helps. But I hope you all are doing well, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!